shot at 3334 in Evergreen. 422, you guys are okay over there?
Albuquerque, New Mexico. One evening, in early 2014, police vehicles rushed to a spot in the mountains that surround this city.
The initial call out to the police came in right around this time of day. It was a local resident in one of the homes in the foothills talking about a suspicious man who was illegally camping.
The man was 38-year-old James Boyd. He was homeless and mentally ill. One of the officers on the scene was Detective Keith Sandy. A dash cam recording caught Sandy saying this to another officer about Boyd.
Detective Sandy was one of more than a dozen officers from various different units who would show up that evening. And in statements taken afterwards, nobody at the scene seemed to know who was in charge.
We're not going to get stupid. You said we were walking out of here. Now
A standoff began that would last several hours. The police say Boyd threatened them with his pocket knives. The final few minutes were caught on this police body cam.
worry about safety, not a murder.
With Boyd seemingly cooperating, the police throw a flashbang grenade.
Do it. Get on the ground! Get on the ground! Get on the ground now! Get on the ground!
In response, Boyd takes out his knives. He was hit 3 times, once in the back.
Move it up! Get your hands up!
This video sparked national attention, and the officers who fired could be convicted of murder.
All right, he's good. Somebody step on that right hand real hard.
But the case has raised larger questions. What sort of culture led this police force to become one of the most violent departments in the country?
Get your hands out! Get your hands out!
Since 2010, the Albuquerque Police Department has shot more than 40 people. 27 of those died. The police here have held one of the highest kill rates in the US. In the case of James Boyd, the city paid $5 million to the family after a civil lawsuit.
All rise, court is now in session.
This is the opening session of the hearing to determine whether the shooters, Keith Sandy and Dominic Perez, will face a criminal trial.
All right, the state, are you ready to proceed? Do you wish to make an opening statement?
We do, Your Honor.
Go right ahead.
After Boyd's death, the Department of Justice released a scathing report on the APD based on a 16-month investigation. It highlighted patterns of excessive force and a, quote, culture of aggression.
There were 19 men surrounding one man alone. Those 19 officers had 19 automatic or semi-automatic weapons. Among them, they had 730 rounds of ammunition, which are depicted in this picture.
This is the first time in decades that an APD shooting has led to criminal proceedings against an officer. Yet in the last few years alone, the city has paid tens of millions of dollars to families bringing civil lawsuits against the police. But the families say many of the officers involved have escaped scrutiny and remain on the force. Officers, they say, who should never have been allowed to join in the first place. In April 2011, 2 APD detectives came to this house to speak to 27-year-old Christopher Torres. His parents rushed home from work after receiving a call from their neighbor.
The mobile crime lab was here. The armored personnel carrier was here. There were SWAT officers up and down the street, perched on rooftops, and I'm thinking to myself, what in the world is going on?
Christopher was schizophrenic and had been home alone. Eventually, they learned that somebody had been taken away in an ambulance.
And so I started calling the local hospitals to see if Christopher was in any of the local emergency rooms. And when I found out he wasn't, well then of course I started to suspect the worst.
Christopher had been shot dead in the backyard by Detective C.J. Brown. The officers said they'd come to serve a months-old arrest warrant for an alleged road rage incident, and Christopher refused to speak to them. Based on court testimony, Detective Brown jumped over the fence and came towards Christopher. This is what Detective Brown looked like that day. The plainclothes officers claimed they identified themselves. Then they said Christopher, who was unarmed, managed to get a hold of one of their guns in a scuffle. So Brown shot him 3 times in the back.
Well, they jumped him and got on top of him, and I mean, it all happened really quickly. I'm sure Christopher didn't know what was happening.
What was the scene like when you guys got here? I mean, was there signs of a struggle?
You could see that things were in disarray over here, and you could see a pool of blood.
That must have just been incredibly traumatic.
It was.
Ultimately, the judge in the civil case found that the police story wasn't credible. And it's not an isolated incident.
There would be a rush when it came to shootings to do everything that could be done to make sure it's they can whatever piece of rice they can put their hat on to say that it's justified.
Thomas Grover is a lawyer and one of a number of ex-APD cops who've been speaking out about the department.
And the officer that was involved in a given shooting has a very bad reputation amongst the officers. And then, nothing happens to them. And, to us, to a lot of good cops out there, that starts smelling really bad.
You start wondering, what's the culture like there? What's happening?
Steve Tate, an ex-APD lieutenant, left in 2006. But he began to pay attention to the patterns in the years that followed.
I would just hear, through people I trusted, that some of the internal affairs investigations didn't look good. I mean, as far as they weren't complete, they didn't have the same detail, the objectivity.
The family's lawyers say the APD never did an investigation into the killing of Torres, but the city paid the family $6 million in a civil suit. Neither officer faced any disciplinary action. Detective Brown remains on the force to this day.
We appreciate the job that the good officers are doing, and we do, but there's a significant number who feel that they can do whatever they want and that they're not going to face any consequences, and that in fact they will be rewarded for excessive use of force.
The day James Boyd was shot, the prosecution claimed that Keith Sandy called his own team to the scene without telling supervisors.
And why did the shooting team arrive? It's because of Keith Sandy.
The defense pointed to Boyd's behavior.
The facts that you're going to hear are about 2 officers following their training, seeing that a fellow officer is in jeopardy of being gravely hurt or killed by a crazy man with 2 knives, and he was.
The state's case was focused on Sandy's actions and motives, but also his past.
He lost his job at the New Mexico State Police, and when APD lowered its standards for police officers in 2007, he was hired by APD.
One lawyer in Albuquerque has spent a lot of time looking into Sandy's previous history. Shannon Kennedy represented Boyd's family in a civil case against the department.
I believe that if Keith Sandy had not been on scene that day, James Matthew Boyd would still be alive.
Kennedy said in 2007, the city's former mayor had promised to beef up police numbers for political gain. APD lowered their standards and took in cops with questionable records, like Sandy.
He was a lateral transfer from the state police, meaning he didn't have to do any kind of independent psychiatric evaluation to qualify, and he had been fired from state police for time card fraud. So he had engaged in conduct that was criminal, that was dishonest, and even having done that, he's hired by APD.
The year Sandy joined, 2007, is a year we kept hearing during our time in Albuquerque. It was the same year the officer who shot Christopher Torres, C.J. Brown, was hired. At another law firm a few blocks away, we heard a similar story about Brown. Brown had actually been rejected by the APD, and twice by another department before 2007.
The first time, and then, the second test, the application discontinued because of attitude.
Because of his attitude.
Kathy Love represented the Torres family in their civil lawsuit. Love and her team had looked into Brown's record at his previous job at the Roswell Police Department.
His history in Roswell was a number of complaints against him for aggressive behavior. I think one of the most concerning is a man who was being pulled over for a routine traffic stop who didn't get out of his car fast enough for the officer, and Detective Brown pulled his gun on him. And the other incidents in Roswell sort of lead to the same conclusion, and sort of if you put it all together, this is a guy who couldn't control his temper, and APD hired him anyway.
The Albuquerque Police Department denied our request to speak to Officer Brown. Out of the officers hired in 2007, the year standards were relaxed. 11 went on to shoot people between 2010 and 2014. That's more than twice the number in any other class. Even on the inside, there was alarm at those getting hired.
And it got to the point where they were such horrible officers. They had such a record of discipline and misconduct, allegations of misconduct and investigations into it, but nothing ever really substantial came to correct that behavior.
And so if you've indicated in your 3, 4, 5, 10 years that you've worked for an agency that you don't have good moral character, you haven't been able to keep your composure and your emotions, you haven't been able to perform well, or you've been in serious misconduct, to me, there's no reason we're required to hire you. And why would we hire you? And why would the citizens of Albuquerque want us hiring those types of officers?
Just a month after Brown killed Christopher Torres, another officer from the 2007 class would fatally shoot a resident. Mike Gomez has spent much of his life in Albuquerque. His focus the past few months has been on the James Boyd shooting.
He was coming down. He was coming down. See that? He was coming down.
When they fired the flashbang.
Yeah.
You can see officers, they've already deployed a flashbang, and now...
This whole incident of Boyd reminds me what happened to my son, It's just so typical of what we've been going through here in Albuquerque is all of this. That's Alan there.
Mike's 22-year-old son, Alan Gomez, had struggled on and off with substance abuse for many years.
I got the 3 kids. See, here they are. Alan was my youngest. This is at my 50th birthday.
Alan's on the right?
Yeah, Alan's there. That's Eric. That's Natalie. That's me.
One night, when Mike was out of town, he woke up to a frantic message from his elder son, Eric.
I see a voicemail, and it's my son just crying, Dad, Dad, you gotta call me, you gotta call me.
Alan had recently relapsed and took some drugs that night. He started acting erratically, shot a gun twice in the air, and refused to let Eric and Eric's girlfriend leave the house. According to Mike, Eric asked his girlfriend to call 911.
He was thinking he was getting help for his brother. He didn't call because he was afraid so much for himself, but because he had never seen his brother act like that before,
Late that night, cops surrounded the house and tried to negotiate with Allen for almost an hour.
Albuquerque Police Department, come out now! Sir, this is Albuquerque Police Department, you need to come out now!
According to a Department of Justice investigation, the police observed Allen coming in and out of the house several times with no incident. But Detective Sean Wallace, a SWAT officer, claimed he saw a gun in Allen's hands the final time Allen came outside. When Allen turned to go back inside, allegedly ignoring calls to surrender, Wallace fatally shot Allen in the back with his rifle. Allen was unarmed. The gun he previously had was found in the hall closet. The DOJ investigation concluded that Allen did not pose an immediate threat and found the shooting to be unjustified.
Where's the gun? Everybody found the gun?
Ask her where the gun was.
No gun on it.
This was Wallace's third shooting in the line of duty. All of those he shot were unarmed. 2 of them fatal. Sean Wallace remains on the APD to this day. The Albuquerque Police Department didn't respond to our request to speak to Officer Wallace.
I took this one at his graduation party. He was happy that night, you know. I was happy too.
Mike says not one person has ever contacted him from the police department regarding Allen's death.
Here's the scene that I had to go into.
Even today, almost 5 years later, Mike says it's hard to think about that night.
I just, you know, it's hard to describe. Your whole body just falls. It goes right through you. It feels like you just hit the ground, your soul.
And Eric, how's he been?
Oh, that's another story. Oh yeah, devastated. He told me, he said, "Dad, you know what? A big brother's supposed to take care of their little brother. You know, they're not supposed to, you know, have him killed." So that was kind of hard, you know. But I mean,
Mike won almost $1 million in a wrongful death settlement for Allen's shooting.
oh, I blame myself. You know, I you know, with the old what ifs.
He would ultimately spearhead a movement to bring the Department of Justice into town, to address what he says is a police department where officers faced no accountability.
They'd come in here knowing that, hey, you know what, we can shoot anybody and get away with it. Our badge is a license to kill.
On the streets of Albuquerque, the reputation of this city's police department is in tatters. While cities like Ferguson and Baltimore erupted, public opinion here was already divided over a police force many felt was going rogue. For those still under any illusions, the DOJ findings made things clearer.
We have determined that there is reasonable cause to believe that the Albuquerque Police Department engages in a pattern or practice of use of excessive force, including the use of unreasonable, deadly force.
But the DOJ didn't investigate the APD's hiring practices, and some residents say the report doesn't seem to have led to much action from those in charge.
We have a pattern and practice of unconstitutional policing that stretches back 3 generations in this city. What makes us think that we're going to finally solve this problem?
David Correa is a professor at the University of New Mexico and has been researching the APD for decades. He says much of the DOJ process has remained private, and that promises by the feds for real change are worthless as long as accountability is still missing.
The fact that police officers are public servants that can use violence in the course of their job makes them different, and therefore we have to treat them differently and hold them accountable and to a higher level of accountability as a community.
The absence of any accountability held upon any of the leaders in the department or any supervisors that, in theory were supervising some of these incidences that are so sensational, just the absence of any accountability just speaks so loudly.
Do you think there is the political will here to change the APD?
No, zero. The proof's in the pudding. They have not done anything other than politically try to cover their rear ends.
This is Officer Tanner Touche.
We've been requesting interviews for months with police and city officials and the local DOJ office.
Hi, Officer Touche. This is Sebastian Walker from Al Jazeera America. We're in town. We're here in Albuquerque. Basically, we're trying to get an interview with anyone from DOJ, just somebody to speak to us on camera while we're here.
DOJ is very strict on our kind of interview.
Don't know what else to do, really, but if you could give me a call back, I'd really appreciate it.
Not one office agreed to an interview. In the end, we tried to catch the police chief in person at a local city council meeting.
Chief Eden, hi, it's Sebastian Walker from Al Jazeera. Hi, we've been trying to get an interview with you for weeks now to talk about the unarmed killings.
Oh, I don't think so. No, go through the proper channel.
Can you explain why nobody from your department has been disciplined for the killing of unarmed civilians? I'm just trying to get a word. Let me just quickly ask the chief. We've been asking for months for an interview now.
We followed up as directed, but no one ever got back to us. The city says it continues to work with the DOJ to implement police reforms. 2015 had fewer fatal shootings by the APD. But to this day, many residents say there's been little official acknowledgement that there's even a problem within the department.
The point of police reform is not to actually resolve the problem of police violence, but to resolve the outrage over police violence. It diffuses the anger and lets this police department return slowly to what it's always been. And I mean always been.
I'm extremely conflicted about why we are here today. We are here today because James Matthew Boyd is not.
It's been 2 years since James Boyd's death, but his legacy lives on in Albuquerque. Before leaving town, we attended a memorial where his brother, Andrew, was speaking.
My brother was a very important person in my life growing up. He's the one that taught me everything I knew about the outdoors. And it's been a really, really hard time having to deal with how things were handled at the foothills. But because of that, I don't think it is a complete tragedy, but an eye-opener for this city to do the right thing.
Keith Sandy and the other officer who shot Boyd will face a murder trial later this year. But Andrew says the real problem lies elsewhere.
He should have never been a police officer, ever. He wants to talk about my brother having a rap sheet. He's got his own rap sheet himself. And he was not even supposed to have a gun or badge. He shouldn't have been out there.
Keith Sandy retired with pension from the APD. While he is facing trial, it's rare for a police officer to be convicted for murder. Today, with a national conversation forming around police violence, Andrew wants those considering reforms to learn from his brother's death.
I don't know if I'm ever going to exactly come to terms with what's happened. I've learned to accept it, and that's why I'm trying to do all the good in this city that I can to make a difference. I don't want his death to be worthless.
Andrew had lost contact with James for years before finding him in Albuquerque. In high school, he'd promised his brother he'd name his son after him. This is the boy. But he never got the chance to meet the uncle whose name he carries.
He was arrested at 981.